Hey guys, tonight we're slipping into the shadowy alcoves of medieval bedchambers where candlelight flickers across pages filled with secrets your history teacher definitely never mentioned. Picture yourself carefully lifting the corner of a heavy wooden marriage chest, your fingers finding a silk-wrapped bundle hidden beneath layers of fine linens. The parchment crackles softly as you unfold what medieval couples called their pillow books, beautifully illustrated manuscripts that served as intimate guides for newlyweds and experienced lovers alike. You're holding knowledge that could have gotten someone excommunicated, or worse. These weren't just pretty pictures, they were survival manuals for navigating the complex world of medieval romance, fertility, and physical intimacy. The illustrations bloom before your eyes in rich blues and golds, depicting everything from herbal remedies to anatomical diagrams that would make a modern sex education teacher blush. You probably won't survive the sheer awkwardness of realizing that medieval people were way more sophisticated about love and relationships than most people give them credit for. While Hollywood loves to portray the Middle Ages as a time of prudish repression, you're about to discover a world where couples actively sought out detailed guidance, artistic inspiration, and practical advice for their most private moments. So, before you settle in completely, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe. But only if you're genuinely curious about the hidden corners of history that textbooks tend to skip. I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there. Are you tucked into bed in London at midnight? Or perhaps catching this during a quiet afternoon in Melbourne? Now, dim those lights, maybe switch on a fan for that gentle white noise, and let's drift together into a medieval world where love was both an art and a carefully studied science. You find yourself in a dimly lit scriptorium around 1320, watching as a monk carefully applies gold leaf to an illustration that would scandalize his abbot. But this isn't just any manuscript, it's one of hundreds of pillow books that circulated secretly among medieval couples, containing everything from astrological timing for conception to detailed botanical guides for natural contraception. These books represented a parallel education system operating entirely outside official church doctrine. The term pillow book itself comes from the Japanese tradition, but medieval Europeans had their own versions, manuscripts with innocent-sounding titles like The Garden of Delights or Secrets of Married Life. You run your finger along the marginalia, noticing how previous owners have added their own notes and corrections, creating a kind of medieval crowdsourced wisdom about intimate relationships. Historians still argue whether these books were primarily medical, recreational, or spiritual in nature, but one thing is clear: they were treasured possessions passed down through generations. The quality of the illustrations alone tells you these weren't cheap productions. Each page cost roughly what a skilled craftsman might earn in a month, making them accessible only to the wealthy or those connected to monastic scriptoriums. You're now walking through the marble corridors of the Byzantine Imperial Palace in Constantinople, circa 1180, where the scent of rosewater mingles with expensive parchment. The Empress herself has just commissioned what will become one of the most elaborate marriage manuals ever created, a text that makes those simple pillow books look like children's picture books. Here, in the heart of the Eastern Roman Empire, intimate knowledge has been elevated to an art form that would make Renaissance masters weep with envy. The Byzantine approach to marital education was gloriously over the top, much like everything else they did. You're examining a manuscript that required 3 years to complete, featuring illustrations painted with genuine crushed pearls and gold, so fine it seems to glow from within. Each page contains not just romantic guidance, but detailed medical diagrams showing the 4 humors' effects on desire, astrological charts for optimal conception timing, and even architectural plans for designing the perfect bridal chamber. What sets Byzantine pillow books apart is their integration of classical Greek medical knowledge with Christian mysticism, a combination that shouldn't work but somehow creates something magical. You're reading passages that quote Galen's anatomical texts alongside prayers for marital bliss, all accompanied by illustrations that manage to be both scientifically accurate and breathtakingly beautiful. The imperial court's physicians contributed extensively to these texts, adding sections on fertility treatments that involved everything from special diets to gemstone therapy. You discover recipes calling for ingredients so exotic they had to be imported from India and China. Saffron mixed with ground pearls, musk combined with rare spices that cost more than most people's annual income. The Byzantines believed that physical pleasure was a reflection of divine harmony, so they spared no expense in perfecting it. One particularly fascinating manuscript you're examining contains what modern scholars call the bride's education sequence, a series of illustrations showing a young woman's progression from wedding day nervousness to confident intimacy. The artistic technique is remarkable. Each figure is rendered with the same care usually reserved for religious icons, suggesting that the Byzantines viewed marital love as genuinely sacred. But here's where it gets interesting. These books weren't just for women. Byzantine men were expected to study them too, creating a culture where both partners approached intimacy with extensive theoretical knowledge. You're flipping through sections specifically designed for grooms, complete with detailed advice on everything from personal hygiene to psychological preparation for marriage. The medical sections are particularly advanced, featuring anatomical knowledge that wouldn't be rediscovered in Western Europe for another 3 centuries. You're looking at diagrams of the reproductive system that are startlingly accurate, accompanied by treatments for various intimate concerns that combine herbal remedies with what can only be described as medieval psychotherapy. Historians still argue whether these elaborate Byzantine texts influenced the development of similar works throughout medieval Europe, but the evidence suggests that diplomatic marriages carried these manuscripts westward like expensive dowry gifts. The quality of the materials alone, vellum so fine it's almost translucent, inks that still shimmer after 8 centuries, indicates these were treasures worthy of international gift-giving. You notice how the Byzantine artists developed a unique visual language for depicting intimacy, symbolic imagery that could convey meaning without crossing into explicit territory. Flowers, fountains, and geometric patterns all carry coded messages that would be immediately understood by educated medieval couples, but might look like purely decorative elements to casual observers. You're now seated in the lush courtyard of a 12th century Baghdad palace, where the sound of fountains mingles with the rustle of silk pages as you discover how Islamic scholars transformed intimate guidance into pure poetry. The manuscript before you opens like a garden blooming in your hands, every page a meadow of metaphors where lovers' bodies become landscapes of wonder, and physical intimacy transforms into spiritual journey through earthly paradise. Islamic pillow books took an entirely different approach from their Byzantine counterparts, wrapping practical advice in layers of gorgeous symbolism that would make even the most prudish medieval reader swoon. You're reading passages where a woman's beauty is compared to a moonlit garden, her touch to morning dew on rose petals, her embrace to the shade of a pomegranate tree on a summer afternoon. This isn't just purple prose, it's a sophisticated educational system disguised as the world's most beautiful love poetry. The genius of Islamic marriage manuals lies in their use of botanical metaphors to discuss anatomy and technique. You discover entire chapters devoted to the Garden of Pleasure, where different flowers represent various aspects of intimacy, and detailed cultivation instructions serve as guidance for couples. A section on tending the jasmine vine turns out to be remarkably practical advice about foreplay, while the art of grafting roses contains information that would make a modern relationship counselor nod approvingly. What's particularly fascinating is how these texts seamlessly blend medical knowledge with spiritual philosophy. You're examining illustrations where human figures are interwoven with geometric patterns that echo mosque decorations, suggesting that marital love was viewed as another form of worship. The Arabic calligraphy itself becomes part of the art, flowing script that mirrors the curves of lovers' bodies, creating manuscripts that are simultaneously educational tools and precious works of art. The medical sections are remarkably advanced, featuring knowledge gathered from across the Islamic world's vast trade networks. You're reading remedies that incorporate ingredients from as far away as Indonesia and Morocco, a global pharmacology of love that puts medieval European medicine to shame. Saffron from Kashmir, frankincense from Somalia, rare herbs from the mountains of Afghanistan, all carefully catalogued with their effects on desire, fertility, and general health. Islamic scholars also developed what you might call the first systematic approach to relationship psychology. These texts contain detailed discussions of compatibility, communication, and emotional intimacy that wouldn't look out of place in a modern self-help book. You're reading advice about understanding your partner's temperament, managing conflicts, and maintaining passion over decades of marriage. Wisdom that feels remarkably contemporary despite being nearly 1,000 years old. The artistic tradition developed its own visual vocabulary, using geometric patterns and floral motifs to suggest rather than explicitly depict intimate moments. You're studying illustrations where intertwining vines represent lovers' embrace, where opening flower buds symbolize awakening desire, where flowing water suggests the rhythms of passion. It's sophisticated symbolic language that allowed artists to create works of stunning beauty while remaining within religious boundaries. Historians still argue whether these Islamic texts directly influenced European traditions, but the evidence suggests extensive cross-pollination through trade routes and diplomatic exchanges. You're examining marginalia in Latin that appears to be translations of Arabic passages, suggesting that medieval Christian scholars were secretly studying and adapting Islamic approaches to marital guidance. The regional variations within the Islamic world are fascinating. Persian texts tend toward mystical symbolism, while Andalusian works show clear influences from classical Greek medicine. Egyptian manuscripts often include detailed astrological charts, reflecting that region's ancient astronomical traditions. Each approach adds unique flavors to the basic recipe of combining practical advice with poetic beauty. You're now creeping through the shadows of a Cistercian monastery in northern France, circa 1240, where Brother Guillaume is doing something that would get him stripped of his habit and possibly burned at the stake. By candlelight, in a hidden alcove behind the scriptorium, he's carefully copying passages from Ovid's Ars Amatoria into what appears to be a devotional manuscript. The irony is delicious. Monks who've taken vows of celibacy, secretly preserving the ancient world's most explicit guides to seduction and pleasure. This underground network of monastic scribes represents one of history's most fascinating contradictions. While publicly condemning earthly desires from their pulpits, these same religious men were quietly ensuring that classical knowledge about love and intimacy survived the medieval period. You're watching Brother Guillaume add his own marginalia to Ovid's text, translating Roman seduction techniques into practical advice for medieval Christian couples. The cognitive dissonance would be hilarious if it weren't so historically significant. The monks had several motivations for this clandestine copying work, and sexual curiosity was probably the least of them. Many were genuinely scholarly, recognizing that these ancient texts contain medical and psychological insights worth preserving. Others were responding to requests from wealthy patrons who wanted classical love poetry for their private libraries. Some may have been creating dowry gifts for noble families. Nothing says welcome to the family like a beautifully illuminated guide to marital bliss. What makes these monastic copies particularly fascinating is how the scribes adapted pagan content for Christian audiences. You're examining a manuscript where Brother Guillaume has inserted biblical quotes alongside Ovid's advice, creating bizarre theological justifications for Roman pickup techniques. As Solomon writes in his Song of Songs, he notes in the margin next to instructions for wooing reluctant lovers, "Thy lips are like a thread of scarlet." The mental gymnastics required to reconcile celibate spirituality with sensual poetry must have been Olympic level. The artistic quality of these secret manuscripts often surpassed their legitimate religious counterparts. Freed from the constraints of depicting saints and biblical scenes, monastic artists could explore more naturalistic human forms and expressions. You're studying illuminations that show remarkable anatomical accuracy for the period. Bodies rendered with the same careful attention usually reserved for Christ's wounds or the Virgin's robes. The distribution network for these texts was surprisingly sophisticated. Monks travelled frequently between monasteries, carrying manuscripts in specially designed compartments of their travelling chests. A text copied in Canterbury might surface months later in a German abbey, having passed through a dozen pairs of hands along the way. This ecclesiastical underground railroad ensured that classical knowledge about love and relationships survived even the most repressive periods of medieval Christianity. Some of the most valuable manuscripts were created as wedding gifts for noble families with connections to specific monasteries. You're examining a gorgeously illuminated copy of classical love poetry created for the marriage of a French count's daughter, complete with family coat of arms worked into the decorative borders. The abbot who commissioned it probably justified the expense as promoting Christian marriage, while secretly enjoying the poetic beauty of pagan sensuality. Historians still argue whether this monastic preservation of erotic literature was systematic or accidental, but the sheer volume of surviving manuscripts suggests deliberate effort. You're looking at evidence from dozens of monasteries across Europe, all showing similar patterns of classical texts being copied, adapted, and distributed through religious networks. The linguistic innovations these monks developed are particularly interesting. Faced with translating explicit Latin passages into vernacular languages, they created euphemistic vocabularies that would influence Romantic literature for centuries. Many French and English words for intimate activities can be traced back to these monastic translations, where creative metaphors were necessary to maintain plausible deniability. You're now standing in the perfumed chambers of Eleanor of Aquitaine's court at Poitiers, circa 1170, where the collision between idealized courtly love and gritty marital reality is creating some truly spectacular literary fireworks. The troubadours are strumming their lutes and singing about impossible, pure love that never consummates, while behind silk curtains, practical marriage manuals are teaching couples exactly how to consummate everything as thoroughly and pleasurably as possible. This cultural contradiction produced some of the most fascinating pillow books in medieval history, manuscripts that attempt to reconcile romantic fantasy with bedroom practicality. You're examining a text that begins with flowery verses about a knight's eternal devotion to his unattainable lady, then abruptly shifts into detailed anatomical diagrams and step-by-step intimacy instructions. It's like reading Shakespeare followed immediately by a medical textbook, and somehow the medieval mind found this combination perfectly logical. The courtly love tradition insisted that true passion required distance, yearning, and preferably complete impossibility. The more married and unattainable your beloved, the more authentic your love. Meanwhile, actual married couples needed practical guidance for creating satisfying relationships that would last decades and produce healthy heirs. The solution was manuscripts that paid lip service to romantic idealism while delivering thoroughly pragmatic advice. You're reading passages where troubadour poetry about ethereal beauty is followed by matter-of-fact discussions of personal hygiene and sexual technique. One particularly entertaining manuscript alternates between verses describing a lady's eyes as stars that illuminate the darkness of desire, and practical tips like ensure both partners have bathed recently and trimmed their fingernails. The tonal whiplash is extraordinary, but apparently medieval readers found this combination helpful rather than jarring. The artistic approach in these manuscripts reflects the same tension. You're studying illuminations that show idealized courtly scenes, knights kneeling before perfectly coiffed ladies in flowing gowns, directly opposite pages depicting anatomically accurate couples in various intimate positions. The artistic skill required to render both romantic fantasy and physical reality with equal beauty speaks to the sophistication of medieval manuscript illuminators. What's particularly fascinating is how these texts handle the problem of male sexual education. Courtly love poetry taught men to be eternally patient, worshipful, and self-denying, not exactly qualities that translate well to the marriage bed. The practical sections had to essentially deprogram troubadour conditioning, teaching husbands that marital intimacy required assertiveness, communication, and attention to their wives' physical responses rather than ethereal devotion to unattainable ideals. The female perspective in these manuscripts is remarkably frank for the period. You're reading advice clearly written by women for women, discussing how to guide romantically educated but sexually inexperienced husbands toward more satisfying encounters. The tone is often gently mocking of male romantic pretensions. One passage suggests that a man who spends too much time composing verses about your eyebrows may need gentle instruction in more practical skills. Regional variations in these courtly practical manuscripts are telling. French versions tend to maintain the romantic pragmatic balance throughout, while German texts often abandon courtly pretense entirely after the first few pages. English manuscripts show clear influence from both traditions, but add distinctly practical Anglo-Saxon attitudes toward marriage as a working partnership, rather than romantic ideal. The economic implications of this literary collision are significant. Wealthy families were commissioning manuscripts that essentially taught their sons and daughters to perform courtly love publicly, while maintaining satisfying marriages privately. You're examining evidence of dowry negotiations that specifically mentioned the inclusion of appropriate marriage guidance texts, alongside more traditional gifts like land and livestock. Historians still argue whether the rise of practical marriage manuals contributed to the eventual decline of courtly love poetry, but the chronological evidence is suggestive. As realistic relationship advice became more widely available, the appeal of impossible romantic ideals seemed to diminish among the nobility who could afford alternative literary entertainment. You're now hunched over a manuscript in the private study of a 13th century physician in Salerno, where the air smells of dried herbs and the pages before you look suspiciously like a religious devotional. The illuminated capital letters gleam with gold leaf. Biblical quotations frame each page, and saints smile benevolently from the margins. But look closer at the actual text, and you'll discover this is actually a comprehensive guide to human anatomy, fertility, and contraception, disguised as a book of prayers, medical knowledge masquerading as spiritual devotion. This clever camouflage was born from necessity rather than deception. Medieval physicians faced a complicated challenge. They needed to preserve and share crucial medical knowledge about reproduction and sexuality, but church authorities viewed such topics as potentially heretical. The solution was brilliantly simple: dress up medical texts in religious clothing so thorough that even suspicious bishops would nod approvingly at these devotional works. The disguise techniques were remarkably sophisticated. You're examining a manuscript titled Prayers for the Blessed State of Marriage that contains some of the most accurate anatomical diagrams of the medieval period. The reproductive system is labelled with biblical references. The womb becomes the sacred vessel of creation, while detailed contraceptive instructions are framed as prayers for wise spacing of God's gifts. It's medical education wrapped in theological packaging so convincing that some historians initially catalogued these texts as purely religious works. The contraceptive knowledge preserved in these disguised texts is particularly impressive, drawing from Greek, Roman, and Islamic medical traditions. You're reading recipes for herbal remedies that modern pharmacologists have confirmed as genuinely effective, combinations of wild carrot seeds, silphium, and other plants that could prevent pregnancy when used correctly, all presented, of course, as prayers for the appropriate timing of divine blessings upon the marriage bed. What makes these texts particularly valuable is their integration of anatomy, psychology, and practical technique. Medieval physicians understood that successful intimacy required knowledge of both physical and emotional factors. You're studying sections that discuss the importance of mutual consent, emotional preparation, and communication between partners, all disguised as spiritual guidance for achieving perfect harmony in Christian marriage. The artistic elements of these disguised manuscripts are masterful exercises in double meaning. You're examining illustrations that appear to show saints in prayer, but actually demonstrate anatomical positions for conception. Garden imagery that looks like biblical paradise contains carefully accurate botanical guides to fertility and contraceptive herbs. Even the decorative borders encode medical information, vine patterns that trace the female reproductive cycle, flower motifs that indicate optimal timing for various activities. The distribution network for these texts was ingenious. Since they appeared to be religious works, they could be openly transported, displayed, and discussed without arousing suspicion. A manuscript that would have been confiscated and burned if recognized as a medical text could sit openly on a noble family's bookshelf, disguised as evidence of their Christian devotion. The linguistic innovations required for this deception created lasting influences on medical and religious vocabulary. Medieval physicians developed elaborate metaphorical languages that allowed them to discuss intimate anatomy using biblical terminology. Many terms for reproductive functions that survived into modern medical Latin originated in these disguised texts, where creative euphemisms were essential for maintaining the religious facade. Regional variations in disguise techniques reveal interesting cultural differences. Italian manuscripts tend toward elaborate theological justifications, while German versions rely more heavily on symbolic imagery. English texts often incorporate elements of popular devotional literature, making them virtually indistinguishable from genuine prayer books to casual examination. Historians still argue whether church authorities were genuinely deceived by these disguises or chose to look the other way, but surviving evidence suggests the camouflage was generally effective. You're examining records of religious libraries that unknowingly preserved comprehensive medical knowledge for centuries, catalogued under devotional literature rather than medical texts. The psychological sophistication of these disguised works is particularly noteworthy, addressing concerns about sexual anxiety, marital compatibility, and relationship satisfaction within frameworks of Christian marriage guidance. You're now being led through the private apartments of a French chateau in 1285, where Lady Marguerite de Montfort is preparing for her wedding night with the kind of elaborate education program that would make modern sex educators jealous. The aristocratic approach to bridal preparation was far more comprehensive than most people realize, a months-long curriculum combining theoretical study, practical demonstrations, and intimate mentorship that transformed nervous virgins into confident wives. The process begins with what medieval nobles called the manuscript nights, weeks of studying illustrated pillow books under the guidance of experienced matrons. You're watching as Lady Marguerite's aunt, a worldly widow who survived 3 marriages, points to various anatomical diagrams while explaining the mysteries of male and female bodies. The illustrations are remarkably detailed, showing everything from basic anatomy to advanced techniques, all rendered with the same artistic care usually reserved for depicting saints. What sets aristocratic wedding preparation apart is the involvement of multiple female relatives and advisors. You're observing a fascinating intergenerational knowledge transfer as grandmother, mother, aunts, and older married cousins each contribute their expertise. The grandmother provides herbal wisdom passed down through generations. The mother shares practical household management skills that extend to bedroom politics, while the aunts offer more recent innovations in maintaining marital satisfaction. The theoretical education is surprisingly comprehensive. Lady Marguerite is studying texts that cover everything from astrological timing for conception to psychological techniques for managing difficult husbands. You're examining manuscripts that contain detailed discussions of female pleasure, not just as a pathway to pregnancy, but as a legitimate goal in itself. This aristocratic approach to sexuality was far more sophisticated than the church-approved lie back and think of England philosophy. The practical preparation involves elements that would seem familiar to modern brides, albeit with medieval twists. You're watching demonstrations of personal hygiene rituals using imported soaps and perfumes, lessons in selecting flattering nightgowns that balance modesty with allure, and even basic instruction in what we'd now call non-verbal communication. The medieval aristocracy understood that successful marriages required both partners to be active participants rather than passive victims of circumstance. One of the most fascinating aspects is the role of the marriage mentor, typically an older female relative who would remain available throughout the first year of marriage for consultation and advice. You're examining correspondence between newly married nobles and their mentors, discussing everything from fertility treatments to techniques for maintaining passion during pregnancy. This support network ensured that aristocratic women weren't left to figure out marital intimacy through trial and error. The economic aspects of this education are significant. Wealthy families invested substantial resources in their daughters' preparation, commissioning custom manuscripts, importing exotic ingredients for beauty treatments, and sometimes bringing in specialists from other regions. You're looking at household accounts that show payments to learned women who provided intimate education, a profession that seems to have been both lucrative and highly respected within aristocratic circles. The artistic elements of aristocratic marriage preparation included commissioned portraits showing the bride in various stages of preparation. These weren't just decorative, they served as educational tools, demonstrating proper posture, expression, and dress for different phases of courtship and marriage. You're studying portraits that function as visual instruction manuals, teaching young women how to project confidence, sensuality, and approachability. Regional variations in aristocratic marriage preparation reflect different cultural emphases. French nobles emphasized refinement and psychological sophistication, while German aristocrats focused more heavily on fertility and household management. English noble families often incorporated elements of both traditions while adding distinctly practical Anglo-Saxon approaches to marital partnership. The documentation of these preparation processes reveals fascinating insights into medieval attitudes toward female sexuality and autonomy. You're reading private letters that discuss topics like personal preferences, compatibility concerns, and strategies for negotiating with husbands, evidence that aristocratic women were encouraged to view marriage as a partnership requiring active engagement rather than passive submission. Historians still argue whether this elaborate preparation actually improved medieval marriages or simply reflected aristocratic excess. But the survival of detailed personal accounts suggests many women found the education genuinely valuable throughout their married lives. You're now seated in the counting house of Master Aldrich the wool merchant in 14th century Bruges, where the rising merchant class is revolutionizing intimate education with their characteristic blend of practicality and social ambition. Unlike the aristocratic approach you just witnessed, merchant families are commissioning marriage manuals that combine romantic guidance with household management, financial planning, and what we might recognize as early relationship counseling, all bound together in manuscripts that reflect their owners' values of hard work, mutual respect, and profitable partnerships. The merchant approach to pillow books is refreshingly pragmatic. You're examining a manuscript commissioned for the marriage of a successful cloth merchant's daughter that includes sections on everything from intimate techniques to managing household accounts during pregnancy. These aren't just love guides, they're comprehensive partnership manuals that treat marriage as both emotional union and business venture. The illustrations show couples not just in romantic poses, but also discussing ledgers, planning investments, and negotiating household responsibilities. What makes merchant marriage manuals particularly fascinating is their emphasis on mutual education. Unlike aristocratic texts that focus primarily on preparing women for male-dominated relationships, merchant families insisted that both partners study these guides together. You're reading prefaces that explicitly state the books are for the instruction of both husband and wife in the blessed arts of matrimony and household prosperity. This egalitarian approach reflects the merchant class's understanding that successful businesses and marriages require competent partners working together. The practical sections of these texts are remarkably detailed. You're studying chapters on managing intimacy while maintaining demanding work schedules, techniques for conceiving children during specific seasons to optimize business cycles, and advice for maintaining romantic connection despite the travel requirements of medieval trade. One particularly thoughtful manuscript includes a section on maintaining affection during long absences, complete with suggestions for romantic correspondence and reunion strategies. The merchant class also pioneered what we might call preventive relationship counseling. Their marriage manuals include extensive discussions of potential conflicts and resolution strategies. You're reading advice on managing disagreements about money, handling stress during difficult business periods, and maintaining intimacy while dealing with the public scrutiny that successful merchants faced. The tone is practical and optimistic. Problems are presented as solvable challenges rather than insurmountable obstacles. The artistic elements of merchant manuscripts reflect their owners' aesthetic sensibilities, less concerned with aristocratic elegance than with clear, useful illustration. You're examining diagrams that prioritize accuracy over beauty, showing anatomical details with the same precision used for technical drawings in contemporary trade manuals. The decorative elements often incorporate symbols of prosperity and partnership, intertwined coins, flourishing trade goods, and architectural elements suggesting stable homes and successful businesses. The regional variations in merchant marriage manuals reveal interesting cultural differences in how various trading communities approached intimate relationships. Flemish texts emphasize partnership and mutual respect, reflecting the relatively egalitarian nature of Flemish commercial culture. Italian merchant manuals show clear influence from classical Roman texts, while German versions often include detailed discussions of legal aspects of marriage and property ownership. The distribution networks for these texts were remarkably efficient, piggybacking on existing trade routes. A marriage manual created in Bruges might be copied and adapted in Venice, then modified again for use in London merchant families. This cross-pollination created a kind of international merchant culture around marriage and intimacy, with successful techniques spreading rapidly through commercial networks. What's particularly interesting is how merchant families use these texts to distinguish themselves from both aristocratic and peasant classes. You're examining manuscripts that explicitly contrast noble idleness and peasant ignorance with merchant values of education, preparation, and mutual partnership. These texts served as both practical guides and statements of class identity. The economic impact of merchant marriage manuals was significant. Successful partnerships directly affected business success, and these texts were viewed as investments in family prosperity. You're looking at evidence that merchant families who used comprehensive marriage preparation experienced lower divorce rates and higher business success, though causation versus correlation remains a matter of scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether merchant marriage manuals represent genuine innovation or simply practical adaptation of existing aristocratic traditions, but their emphasis on partnership and mutual education certainly influenced later developments in European marriage culture. You're now wandering through the herb garden of the Abbey of Sainte-Foy at dawn, where the morning mist clings to plants that have been cultivating desire and controlling fertility for centuries. Sister Mathilde, the Abbey's herbalist, is discreetly harvesting seeds and roots that will find their way into the most intimate chapters of medieval pillow books, because no guide to marital bliss was complete without its pharmaceutical appendix of love potions, fertility treatments, and contraceptive remedies. The medieval garden was essentially a living pharmacy for lovers, and the knowledge of which plants could enhance desire, prevent conception, or cure intimate ailments was passed down through generations of herbalists, with the kind of precision we'd expect from modern pharmaceutical companies. You're kneeling beside plots of wild carrot, whose seeds were so effective as contraceptives that they nearly went extinct from overharvesting. The irony that celibate nuns were the primary cultivators of aphrodisiac herbs wasn't lost on medieval people. It was simply pragmatic resource management. The aphrodisiac recipes found in pillow books read like medieval chemistry experiments, combining local herbs with exotic spices imported at enormous cost. You're examining a recipe that calls for powdered rhinoceros horn mixed with local sage and honey, a concoction that would have cost more than most peasants earned in a year. The wealthy didn't just want effective love potions, they wanted exclusive ones that demonstrated their access to global trade networks. What's particularly fascinating is how these herbal remedies were integrated into romantic courtship rituals. You're reading instructions for lovers to prepare special meals together, gathering and grinding herbs while discussing their desires and expectations. The process itself was considered as important as the final product, a kind of medieval foreplay that combined practical education with intimate bonding. The act of creating love potions together became a form of romantic communication. The fertility treatments described in these texts show remarkable sophistication, combining accurate botanical knowledge with what we'd now recognize as fertility awareness methods. You're studying charts that correlate specific herbs with different phases of the menstrual cycle, creating personalized treatment plans that modern reproductive medicine would find surprisingly logical. Medieval herbalists understood that timing was everything in both conception and contraception. The contraceptive knowledge preserved in pillow books represents one of the most advanced aspects of medieval medicine. You're examining recipes that combine silphium, now extinct from overuse, wild carrot seeds, and other plants that modern research has confirmed as genuinely effective spermicides and abortifacients. This knowledge was so valuable that it was often encrypted in code words and symbolic illustrations to prevent misuse or theft. The preparation rituals for these herbal remedies were elaborate affairs that combined practical chemistry with romantic theatre. You're reading instructions that specify not just ingredients and proportions, but also the optimal moon phases for gathering herbs, the proper songs to sing while grinding ingredients, and the specific prayers to recite while consuming the final preparations. Medieval people understood that psychological factors could enhance or diminish the effectiveness of physical treatments. Regional variations in herbal love recipes reflect local climate and available plants. Mediterranean texts rely heavily on olive oil-based preparations and wine infusions, while Northern European manuscripts emphasize root vegetables and fermented honey preparations. You're comparing recipes from different regions and noticing how local ingredients were adapted for similar purposes, a kind of medieval pharmaceutical localization. The economic aspects of the medieval aphrodisiac trade were significant. You're examining records showing that certain herbs commanded prices comparable to precious metals, creating entire industries around cultivation, processing, and distribution. Some monasteries and convents essentially funded their operations through discreet sales of herbal preparations to wealthy families preparing for marriages or struggling with fertility issues. The dangerous side of medieval love potions is also well documented in these texts. You're reading warnings about overdoses, incompatible herb combinations, and the risks of using treatments without proper supervision. Some manuscripts include detailed antidotes for various herbal preparations, suggesting that poisoning from love potions was a genuine concern. Historians still argue whether these herbal remedies were primarily medical or magical in nature, but the careful botanical descriptions and preparation instructions suggest that medieval herbalists were practicing a form of proto-pharmacology rather than simple superstition. The effectiveness of many traditional remedies has been confirmed by modern research, validating centuries of carefully preserved knowledge. You're now peering over the shoulder of master illuminator Jean de Belleville in his Parisian workshop, circa 1340, where he's applying the final touches to what might be the most scandalous manuscript of his career. The colours shimmer under candlelight, ultramarine blue that costs more than gold, vermilion red ground from precious cinnabar, and silver leaf so delicate it seems to float above the parchment. But it's not the materials that make this work controversial. It's the sophisticated visual language he's developed for depicting intimacy without crossing into explicit territory. Medieval manuscript illuminators faced a unique artistic challenge when illustrating pillow books: how to convey intimate knowledge while maintaining plausible deniability if questioned by church authorities. The solution was a complex symbolic system that could communicate detailed information to educated viewers while appearing innocuous to casual observers. You're watching John carefully paint a garden scene that looks like a simple paradise illustration, but actually contains precise anatomical guidance encoded in the placement of flowers, the flow of water, and the positioning of symbolic animals. The colour symbolism alone would require a graduate course to fully understand. Red ochre indicated passion and fertility, but mixed with specific proportions of gold leaf, it conveyed information about optimal timing for conception. Blue ultramarine suggested coolness and patience, but when used in floral illustrations, it provided coded instructions for techniques requiring gentle approach. You're examining pages where the colour palette itself tells a story about the progression of intimate encounters, from initial attraction through various stages of physical and emotional connection. The geometric patterns woven throughout these illuminations weren't merely decorative. They encoded practical information about positioning, timing, and technique. You're studying borders that appear to be simple vine patterns, but actually trace anatomical structures, showing how artistic beauty could disguise medical accuracy. The mathematical precision required to create illustrations that function simultaneously as art and instruction speaks to the incredible skill of medieval illuminators. Animal symbolism provided another layer of coded meaning. Rabbits obviously suggested fertility, but their specific positions and interactions conveyed detailed information about conception techniques. Birds represented various aspects of courtship and romance, while their flight patterns illustrated different approaches to intimacy. You're examining a manuscript where an apparently innocent bestiary actually contains comprehensive guidance for marital relations, all disguised as natural history illustration. The integration of architectural elements into these illuminated pillow books reflects medieval understanding of environment's importance in intimate relationships. You're studying illustrations of bedchambers that show not just romantic settings, but specific lighting, furniture arrangement, and decorative elements believed to enhance desire and pleasure. The artists were essentially creating interior design guides for optimal romantic environments. The technical innovations developed for these specialized manuscripts influenced broader artistic traditions. Illuminators working on pillow books pioneered techniques for depicting human anatomy with greater accuracy and sensitivity. You're examining flesh tones that show remarkable understanding of how light plays across skin, hair textures that suggest tactile qualities, and facial expressions that convey subtle emotional states. These technical advances eventually found their way into religious art, creating more humanistic depictions of saints and biblical figures. The workshop organisation required for producing these complex manuscripts was sophisticated. You're watching Jean collaborate with specialists. One artist focused entirely on faces and expressions, another specialised in drapery and textiles, while a third handled architectural backgrounds. The coordination required to create cohesive symbolic narratives across multiple hands speaks to the professional organisation of medieval artistic production. Regional artistic styles influenced the visual language of intimate manuscripts. French illuminators favoured elegant, flowing lines and courtly imagery, while Flemish artists emphasised domestic settings and practical details. Italian manuscripts show clear influence from classical Roman art, with more naturalistic anatomy and architectural elements. German illuminators often incorporated Gothic architectural details and more symbolic, less naturalistic approaches to human figures. The preservation techniques developed for these valuable manuscripts included special storage methods and handling procedures. You're examining evidence of specially designed containers, protective wrappings and careful cataloguing systems that ensured these precious works survived centuries of ownership transfer. Historians still argue whether the symbolic complexity of these illuminated pillow books represents conscious artistic innovation or gradual evolution of existing traditions, but the sophistication of the visual language suggests deliberate development of new artistic vocabularies specifically for intimate education. You're now standing at the dusty crossroads where three cultures meet, watching as a Venetian merchant, an Arab scholar, and a Jewish physician compare their respective collections of intimate manuscripts in the shadow of a Crusader castle, circa 1190. The cross-cultural exchange of romantic and sexual knowledge during the medieval period created a fascinating underground network of scholars, translators, and curious lovers who transcended religious and political boundaries in their pursuit of understanding human intimacy. The Crusades, for all their violence and religious fervour, inadvertently created the perfect conditions for exchanging intimate knowledge across cultural boundaries. You're examining a manuscript that clearly shows Islamic botanical illustrations copied by Christian scribes, with Hebrew marginalia added by Jewish physicians, all bound together in a single volume that represents centuries of cross-cultural collaboration. The irony that holy wars facilitated the spread of love manuals wasn't lost on medieval scholars. They simply kept quiet about it. The translation networks that developed around these texts were remarkably sophisticated. You're following the journey of a single Arabic treatise on marital harmony as it travels from Cordoba to Toledo, where it's translated into Latin by a Jewish scholar, then copied by Christian monks who add their own observations, before finally being adapted into vernacular French by a court physician. Each translation adds layers of cultural interpretation while preserving the core medical and practical knowledge. What makes this cross-cultural exchange particularly fascinating is how different religious traditions approach the same fundamental human concerns. Islamic texts emphasized spiritual dimensions of physical love, viewing marital intimacy as a reflection of divine harmony. Christian manuscripts struggled with reconciling earthly pleasure with spiritual devotion, often creating complex theological justifications for practical advice. Jewish texts frequently approached intimacy through the lens of health and family obligation, integrating romantic guidance with broader discussions of household management and religious observance. The medical knowledge that crossed cultural boundaries was particularly valuable. You're examining an Islamic anatomical diagram that's been copied into a Christian manuscript with Latin labels, then annotated by a Jewish physician who adds corrections based on his own observations. This collaborative approach to medical knowledge created texts that were far more accurate and comprehensive than any single cultural tradition could have produced alone. The trade routes that carried these manuscripts created a kind of medieval international dating advice network. A fertility treatment developed in Baghdad might be adapted for use in Paris, while a French approach to romantic courtship could influence marriage customs in Sicily. You're tracing evidence of how specific techniques and traditions spread along commercial routes, carried by merchants who often served as informal marriage counselors in the communities they visited. The linguistic innovations required for these cross-cultural exchanges created lasting influences on Romantic vocabulary. Arabic terms for various aspects of intimacy entered Latin through translations, then spread into vernacular languages across Europe. Hebrew medical terminology influenced Christian texts, while Christian mystical language found its way into Islamic love poetry. You're examining manuscripts that represent genuine linguistic fusion, where multiple cultural traditions blend into new forms of expression. The artistic traditions that merged through these exchanges created unique hybrid styles. You're studying illuminations that combine Islamic geometric patterns with Christian symbolic imagery and Jewish textual traditions. The visual language that emerged from these cultural encounters influenced artistic production across the Mediterranean world, creating aesthetic approaches that transcended religious boundaries. The scholarly networks that facilitated these exchanges were often informal, but remarkably effective. You're reading correspondence between scholars from different religious traditions who shared observations about anatomy, psychology, and relationship dynamics, despite official prohibitions on such communication. These intellectual friendships created channels for knowledge exchange that operated entirely outside formal diplomatic or commercial relationships. Regional centers of translation and cultural exchange developed their own specialties. Toledo became famous for Arabic to Latin translations of medical texts, while Sicily specialized in adapting Islamic philosophical approaches to love and marriage for Christian audiences. Cordoba developed sophisticated techniques for encoding controversial knowledge in apparently innocent texts, while Venice perfected the art of discreet international distribution. Historians still argue whether this cross-cultural exchange of intimate knowledge contributed to broader medieval cultural development or remained isolated within specialist scholarly networks. But the evidence suggests that romantic and sexual knowledge was one of the most actively traded intellectual commodities of the medieval period. You're now traveling across medieval Europe with a merchant's caravan, stopping at courts and monasteries from Palermo to Prague, and discovering how dramatically approaches to intimate education varied from region to region. What worked for passionate Italians might scandalize proper Germans, while techniques that French nobles considered essential could leave English couples completely bewildered. The regional variations in pillow books and marriage manuals reveal fascinating insights into how geography, climate, culture, and local customs shaped medieval attitudes toward love and sexuality. The Italian approach to intimate manuscripts was gloriously theatrical, influenced by both classical Roman traditions and the passionate Mediterranean temperament. You're examining a Venetian pillow book that reads like a romantic opera libretto, complete with dramatic declarations of eternal devotion alongside highly detailed anatomical instructions. Italian illuminators favored warm colors and sensuous curves, creating manuscripts that celebrated physical beauty and emotional intensity in equal measure. The artistic tradition here treated marital love as performance art, worthy of the same attention devoted to painting saints or depicting biblical scenes. French intimate manuscripts reflected the sophisticated courtly culture that invented romantic love as a literary concept. You're studying texts that approach marital intimacy as an elaborate dance of psychological subtlety and refined technique. French scribes developed the most sophisticated vocabulary for discussing emotional aspects of relationships, creating terms and concepts that influenced romantic literature across Europe. Their manuscripts often included detailed discussions of conversation, mood, and atmospheric elements that other regional traditions ignored entirely. German approaches to marriage guidance were characteristically thorough and systematic, treating intimate education like any other practical skill, requiring careful instruction and methodical practice. You're examining a Bavarian manuscript that organizes intimate techniques into categories and subcategories, complete with numbered lists and cross-references that would impress a modern technical manual writer. German illuminators favored precise anatomical diagrams over romantic imagery, creating educational texts that prioritized accuracy and comprehensiveness over artistic beauty. English marriage manuals showed a distinctly practical Anglo-Saxon sensibility, focusing on partnership dynamics and household management alongside intimate guidance. You're reading texts that treat marital relationships as collaborative enterprises, requiring negotiation, compromise, and mutual respect. English manuscripts often included extensive discussions of economic cooperation, property management, and child-rearing responsibilities, approaching marriage as a comprehensive life partnership rather than primarily romantic union. The differences extended to specific techniques and preferences. Mediterranean manuscripts emphasize passionate intensity and emotional expression, while Northern European texts focused on gentleness, patience, and gradual development of intimacy. You're comparing instructions for identical activities that vary dramatically based on regional assumptions about appropriate emotional expression and physical interaction. Climate and geography influence these regional variations more than you might expect. Northern manuscripts included extensive discussions of maintaining romance during long winter months, while Mediterranean texts address the challenges of summer heat and the need for afternoon rest periods. Alpine regions develop specialized advice for couples dealing with seasonal isolation, while coastal areas focused on maintaining relationships despite extended sea voyages. Religious variations also played significant roles. Regions with strong Islamic influence showed sophisticated approaches to pleasure and desire, while areas dominated by strict Christian monasticism developed more restrained approaches that emphasized procreation and family stability. You're examining manuscripts from regions where multiple religious traditions coexisted, showing fascinating hybrid approaches that combined different theological perspectives. The linguistic differences created interesting challenges for couples who married across regional boundaries. You're reading accounts of French brides struggling to understand German marriage customs, while Italian grooms found English approaches to intimacy completely mystifying. Some manuscripts specifically address these cross-cultural marriage challenges, providing translation guides not just for language, but for entire systems of romantic expectation and intimate practice. Economic factors influenced regional variations significantly. Wealthy Italian city-states could afford elaborate illustrated manuscripts with expensive imported pigments, while German merchants preferred practical texts that emphasized value and durability. French noble families commissioned custom works that reflected individual family traditions, while English manuscripts often showed signs of being copied and recopied to reduce costs. The preservation patterns of these regional manuscripts reflect different cultural attitudes toward intimate knowledge. Italian texts were often preserved as family treasures. German manuscripts survived through systematic monastery libraries, while French works were frequently updated and adapted by successive generations of users. Historians still argue whether these regional variations represent fundamental cultural differences or simply local adaptations of universal human needs. But the diversity of approaches suggests that medieval people were far more creative and adaptable in their intimate lives than popular stereotypes suggest. You're now witnessing the ultimate medieval game of hide and seek as church authorities launch systematic campaigns to suppress pillow books, while couples develop increasingly creative methods to protect their intimate knowledge. The tension between official Christian doctrine and private marital reality created a fascinating underground culture where possession of the wrong manuscript could mean excommunication, exile, or worse. Yet demand for these texts remained so strong that entire networks developed to ensure their survival and distribution. The Church's opposition to intimate manuscripts wasn't simply prudish morality. It represented a fundamental theological concern about the proper role of physical pleasure in Christian marriage. You're examining a bishop's letter from 1278 that condemns books of carnal instruction that lead souls toward damnation through excessive attention to worldly desires. The official position held that marital relations should focus exclusively on procreation, making any text that discussed pleasure, technique, or emotional satisfaction potentially heretical. The enforcement campaigns were surprisingly sophisticated. You're watching church investigators who developed expertise in recognizing disguised pillow books, learning to spot medical texts that contain too much anatomical detail, devotional works with suspiciously practical advice, and artistic manuscripts with coded symbolic imagery. Some bishops employed former scribes who specialized in identifying the visual signatures of different illuminators known for creating intimate texts. The underground distribution networks that developed in response were equally ingenious. You're following a manuscript that travels from a monastery in France to a noble household in England through a chain of ostensibly religious communications. The text is disguised as a commentary on the Song of Songs, passed between convents under the pretext of scholarly correspondence, then delivered to its final destination wrapped in legitimate theological documents. The psychological warfare between authorities and book lovers created some truly creative camouflage techniques. You're examining a manuscript that appears to be a perfectly innocent collection of saints' lives until you realize that the marginalia contains detailed, intimate instructions written in a code based on biblical genealogies. Another text disguises anatomical diagrams as symbolic representations of Christ's wounds, while fertility advice is encoded in discussions of agricultural cycles. The regional variations in suppression efforts reflected different approaches to ecclesiastical authority. Italian church officials tended toward dramatic public burnings of confiscated manuscripts, while German bishops preferred quiet confiscation and monastery storage. French authorities often negotiated private arrangements with noble families, allowing discreet retention of texts in exchange for donations or political support. The economic underground that developed around banned books was remarkably profitable. You're examining evidence of professional copyists who specialized in creating multiple camouflaged versions of popular texts, charging premium prices for their expertise in avoiding detection. Some scribes developed reputations as artists who could create pillow books so thoroughly disguised that they passed inspection by even suspicious church authorities. The preservation strategies employed by determined couples ranged from ingenious to desperate. You're discovering texts hidden in false bottoms of jewelry boxes, sewn into quilt linings, buried in garden plots, and even tattooed in coded form on trusted servants. Some families developed elaborate oral traditions to preserve essential knowledge when physical manuscripts became too dangerous to retain. The legal complications surrounding these suppression efforts were considerable. Noble families with connections to church hierarchy could often negotiate exceptions or delays, while wealthy merchants might purchase informal protection through strategic donations. You're reading court records that show the complex political maneuvering required to keep valuable manuscripts while maintaining relationships with religious authorities. The psychological impact of this suppression created interesting cultural effects. The forbidden nature of intimate knowledge made these texts even more precious to their owners, elevating pillow books from practical guides to treasured symbols of marital autonomy. You're examining personal letters that discuss these manuscripts in terms usually reserved for religious relics or family heirlooms. The scholarly resistance to suppression efforts included some surprising allies within the church itself. You're discovering evidence of monks and priests who quietly protected valuable texts by reclassifying them as medical rather than romantic works, or by incorporating essential knowledge into apparently innocent religious commentaries. This internal resistance suggests that even within church hierarchy, there was recognition of the practical value of intimate education. The survival rates of different types of manuscripts reveal interesting patterns. Texts with effective camouflage survived at much higher rates than obviously intimate works, while manuscripts with powerful family protection had better preservation chances than those owned by individuals without political connections. Historians still argue whether church suppression efforts were primarily theological or represented broader attempts to control family autonomy and sexual knowledge, but the intensity of both suppression and resistance suggests that these manuscripts represented something far more significant than simple curiosity about intimate techniques. You're now holding a manuscript that has been passed down through 7 generations of the de Montclair family, its vellum pages soft with age, and its margins crowded with annotations from great-grandmothers, aunts and daughters, who each added their own wisdom to this treasured collection of intimate knowledge. These legacy pillow books represent one of the most fascinating aspects of medieval manuscript culture, texts that served as living documents, growing and evolving as each generation contributed their experiences, corrections, and innovations to the family's accumulated romantic wisdom. The practice of generational manuscript inheritance created some of the most valuable and comprehensive intimate guides of the medieval period. You're examining pages where a 13th century bride's careful notes about herbal remedies are supplemented by her daughter's observations about managing intimacy during pregnancy, which are then expanded by her granddaughter's advice about maintaining passion through decades of marriage. Each layer of annotation represents lived experience tested against theoretical knowledge, creating texts that combine scholarly authority with practical wisdom. What makes these family manuscripts particularly fascinating is how they document the evolution of intimate knowledge over time. You're reading a section on fertility treatments where the original text recommends expensive imported herbs, followed by marginal notes from later generations who discovered that local alternatives worked just as well and cost far less. The accumulated wisdom represents a kind of medieval crowdsourcing, where multiple women contributed their discoveries to benefit future family members. The artistic evolution of these inherited manuscripts is equally compelling. You're studying illuminations that have been carefully updated by successive generations, with new symbolic elements added to reflect changing family circumstances and cultural influences. A garden scene originally painted in the 1200s shows evidence of modifications made in the 1300s and 1400s, creating layered artworks that document changing aesthetic sensibilities alongside evolving intimate knowledge. The linguistic changes preserved in these texts provide fascinating insights into how romantic vocabulary developed over time. You're examining a manuscript where original Latin passages have been translated into Old French by one generation, then updated to Middle French by their descendants, with each translation reflecting contemporary understanding of intimate terminology. The evolution of language mirrors the development of more sophisticated approaches to discussing sexuality and relationships. The economic investment represented by these family manuscripts was enormous. You're calculating the cumulative value of materials, labor, and updates that went into maintaining these texts over multiple generations. Some families spent more on preserving and updating their pillow books than on maintaining their ancestral homes, suggesting that intimate knowledge was considered as valuable as land or precious metals. The social functions of these inherited texts extended far beyond individual instruction. You're reading evidence that these manuscripts served as bonding mechanisms between female relatives, creating opportunities for intergenerational conversations about marriage, sexuality, and relationship management. The shared study of family pillow books became a rite of passage, marking young women's transition from childhood to adult understanding of intimate relationships. The regional variations in inheritance patterns reflect different cultural approaches to family authority and female autonomy. Northern European families tended to pass manuscripts from mother to daughter in direct lines, while Mediterranean traditions often involved broader networks of female relatives in the education process. Some families maintained multiple copies of essential texts, ensuring that knowledge wouldn't be lost through accident or confiscation. The preservation challenges facing these multi-generational manuscripts were considerable. You're examining evidence of families who employed professional scribes to create fresh copies when original texts became too fragile for regular use, ensuring that accumulated wisdom wouldn't be lost to physical deterioration. Some families maintained both working copies for daily reference and archival versions for long-term preservation. The psychological significance of these inherited texts cannot be overstated. You're reading personal letters that describe the emotional importance of receiving the family manuscript, marking not just access to practical knowledge, but acceptance into the community of married women within the extended family. The book served as tangible connections to ancestral wisdom and future generations' needs. The scholarly value of these family manuscripts is immense, representing some of the most comprehensive records of how medieval attitudes toward intimacy and relationships evolved over time. You're examining texts that document changing approaches to contraception, evolving understanding of female anatomy, and developing sophistication in relationship psychology. The survival strategies employed by families determined to preserve their manuscripts through political upheavals, religious persecution, and economic hardship created some of the most ingenious preservation techniques in medieval history. You're discovering evidence of texts that were divided among multiple family members, hidden in different locations, and even memorized by trusted relatives to ensure survival through dangerous periods. Historians still argue whether these family inheritance patterns represent unique medieval innovations or continuation of ancient traditions, but the sophistication of the accumulated knowledge suggests that medieval families understood the value of preserving and transmitting intimate wisdom across generations. You're now standing at the threshold of the Renaissance, watching as the final candlelit manuscript workshops of the 15th century give way to the mechanical precision of printing presses, and witnessing how this technological revolution transformed the intimate, personal world of medieval pillow books into something entirely different. The printing press didn't just change how books were made, it fundamentally altered who could access intimate knowledge, how it was shared, and what society considered appropriate for public discussion versus private whisper. The transition from handwritten manuscripts to printed books marked the end of an era when intimate knowledge was precious, personal, and carefully guarded. You're examining one of the last great manuscript pillow books, created in 1485 for a Florentine merchant family, its pages still glowing with hand-applied gold leaf and personalized illustrations. Beside it sits a crude printed pamphlet from 1495, containing similar information, but stripped of artistic beauty and personal connection, mass-produced knowledge that anyone with a few coins could purchase. The democratization of intimate knowledge through printing had profound social consequences. You're watching as information that once required generations to accumulate and substantial wealth to access suddenly becomes available to anyone literate enough to read printed text. The exclusive world of aristocratic marriage education begins to crumble as middle-class families gain access to the same romantic and sexual knowledge that once marked the divide between nobility and common folk. But something essential was lost in this transition. The medieval manuscript tradition had created intimate knowledge as a personal, family-centered experience where wisdom was passed down through trusted relationships and carefully adapted to individual circumstances. You're comparing the warm, personal tone of a handwritten family manuscript with the cold, impersonal voice of early printed sex manuals, noticing how the mechanization of production changed not just the medium, but the entire nature of intimate education. The artistic tradition of manuscript illumination couldn't survive the economics of mass production. You're examining the last generation of illuminated pillow books, their creators already knowing that their craft was doomed by technological change. The symbolic visual language that had allowed medieval artists to encode intimate knowledge in beautiful, socially acceptable imagery was replaced by crude woodcut illustrations that prioritized cheap reproduction over artistic sophistication or cultural sensitivity. The religious and social control mechanisms that had shaped medieval intimate literature were also transformed by printing. You're watching as church authorities, who had spent centuries playing cat and mouse with individual manuscript owners, suddenly faced the impossible task of controlling mass-produced books that could be printed faster than they could be confiscated. The underground networks that had preserved intimate knowledge for centuries became obsolete almost overnight. The regional variations that had made medieval pillow books so culturally rich began to disappear as printed books created standardized approaches to intimate education. You're observing how the unique French, German, Italian, and English traditions of romantic guidance started to blend into generic European approaches designed for mass markets rather than specific cultural contexts. The economic implications were staggering. Manuscript illuminators, specialized scribes, and the entire network of craftspeople who had created medieval pillow books found their skills suddenly worthless. You're reading accounts of master illuminators who spent their final years creating simple woodcut designs for printing presses, their artistic genius reduced to basic technical illustration. Yet the Renaissance also brought new possibilities. The same printing technology that destroyed medieval manuscript culture enabled the development of more comprehensive, systematically organized approaches to intimate education. You're examining early printed books that combined knowledge from multiple manuscript traditions, creating synthetic works that no single medieval family could have afforded to commission. The psychological impact of this transition was profound. You're reading personal accounts from the last generation to experience traditional, manuscript-based intimate education, describing their sense of loss as precious family knowledge became common commercial property. The intimate, personal nature of sexual and romantic education was replaced by impersonal, standardized information that anyone could access. The scholarly traditions that had preserved and transmitted intimate knowledge through the medieval period adapted to the new technology, but not without significant changes. You're observing how learned physicians and relationship counselors shifted from creating personalized manuscripts for individual families to writing general text designed for unknown audiences. As you watch the final manuscript workshop close its doors in 1502, the last master illuminator carefully wrapping his unused gold leaf and precious pigments, you're witnessing the end of a tradition that had made intimate knowledge beautiful, personal, and sacred. The medieval world of pillow books, with their gorgeous illuminations and carefully guarded wisdom, was giving way to a more democratic but less magical approach to human relationships. The Renaissance brought knowledge to the masses, but it also ended the age when love itself was considered an art worthy of the finest materials and most skilled craftsmen. The intimate wisdom that had once been painted with gold and bound in silk would now be printed with cheap ink on rough paper, available to all but precious to none. The candlelight flickers lower now, casting dancing shadows across the final pages of our journey through medieval intimacy. You've travelled through centuries of hidden knowledge, from Byzantine palaces to monastery scriptoriums, from merchant workshops to noble bedchambers. You've seen how love was studied, taught, preserved, and passed down through generations, who understood that the mysteries of human connection deserved the same careful attention as theology or medicine. As you close these imaginary manuscripts and let the medieval world fade back into history, remember that the desire for understanding, connection, and lasting love hasn't changed much over the centuries. Those long-ago couples who studied their pillow books by candlelight, who mixed love potions in herb gardens, who carefully preserved family wisdom for future generations, they were grappling with the same fundamental questions about intimacy and relationships that we face today. The techniques may have evolved, the artistic traditions may have vanished, but the human heart remains wonderfully, mysteriously constant. Medieval lovers learned that lasting passion required knowledge, patience, and care, lessons that remain just as relevant today as they were when first illuminated in gold leaf on precious vellum. Let the gentle wisdom of those medieval voices whisper you towards sleep, carrying with them the understanding that love has always been humanity's most beautiful and challenging art. Sweet dreams, dear listeners, and may your own love stories be worthy of illumination.